Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. Ladies and gentlemen, delegates, senators.
Can you hear him?
I'm very happy to be back in this town again after living nearby for quite a long time. I'm very honored to be with people who are doing the kind of work that you all do. I'm just a talker, you're a doer, so the honor's mine, not yours. Talking has its uses, and so I'll do a little of it. John told me I should speak for 20 minutes, which is, for a professor, is like giving a starving man an hors d'oeuvre, but I'll hold myself to it. And the topic he wanted me to talk about is how do poverty and inequality endanger Virginia, and are there solutions? Let me say, to begin with, that I'm not here really to tell you your business, which is fighting poverty at the community level and the legislative level. I might have something helpful possibly to say about how to think about the problem and why it's so difficult to think about the problem, to get other people to think about it, why it's such a hard sell politically. It shouldn't be a hard sell politically when you think that we're, most people in this country, the products of an Abrahamic religious tradition of one kind or another, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, whatever. And if there's one thing that all those traditions agree on, it's the need of doing something about poverty. So the first thing I'd like to say about how poverty endangers Virginia is that it's wrong, and things that are wrong are dangerous. In fact, I think that's really the lesson of the prophets. One of the great lessons of the prophets. I wrote a book about Isaiah and Jeremiah a few years ago, in which, doing the research for it, reading them, it struck me that when they talk about disasters befalling Israel as a result of the unrighteousness of the people, they're really, if you read that closely, and if you know the history of the period when all these empires were conquering everything and occupying Israel and destroying the temple and all that, they were not saying you were unrighteous, so therefore you angered God and God is punishing you. They were saying that there are certain kinds of unrighteousness that carry their own punishment with them, that so weaken a society and demoralize a society and give rise to bad ideas in society, that the sin carries its own punishment with it, that you're not going to be able to have a strong and healthy society, you're not even be able to uphold your position in international affairs if you've already weakened yourself by activities and inactivities that destroy community and that demoralize a society. So if you want to talk about how poverty endangers Virginia, and by the way, I'm tending more and more in time to talk about, not just about poverty in the sense of those people who are below the poverty level. I know you all don't talk about that either, that you go higher. You're looking at people who are not necessarily that bad off, but we're close to it. The Europeans have an interesting term for that. They call it precarity, because they talk about people whose situation is precarious. So we talk about more and more in my classes where we're doing this discussion in the university, which I want to get back to in a minute. We're talking about poverty, inequality, and precarity. PIP. Poverty, inequality, and precarity. Because if you're talking just about poverty, about people who are below the very low set poverty line, that will have $1,000 for an individual. Try living on that. You are talking about a relatively small group of people, and sometimes people who are culturally distinguishable from the majority in various ways. Whereas when you talk about poverty, inequality, and precarity, you talk about a much larger number of people. People who should really be natural allies in doing something to combat the causes of poverty, but who, because of the situation, which I'll talk about a little bit in a moment, are so afraid, so insecure about their own precarity that their tendency is often politically to identify up rather than down, and to fear and despise the people who are lower down on the scale than they are. How does poverty endanger Virginia? Well, we can talk in a very dollars and cents way about this, but I don't want to do that, because one of the things I think you may have discovered yourself in discussing poverty with people, or inequality, is the extent to which folks tend to talk about this in terms of statistics. Even I came here with some statistics, which I pulled out to dramatize the way poverty destroys community. We have a state, for example, in which I think we're rated 9th or 10th among all the states. Pretty good in terms of the poverty rate. Again, using this very low set. Governments always understate the amount of poverty in their own jurisdiction. So, but even so, Virginia's doing pretty good. But then when you look at what Virginia is and what's happening where, you find that this Northern Virginia poverty rate's about 6%. And of course, there are pockets of much higher poverty in Northern Virginia, but that's the overall rate. Whereas in inner city areas like Hampton, Norfolk, Portsmouth, 65 to 76% people in poverty. More than 20% in the south side, southwest, and parts of central Virginia, in the coal areas and so forth. So we are a relatively prosperous state by national standards, yet we have somewhat more than 800,000 Virginians in poverty, including about 300,000 children. And that's below the federal poverty line. That's not talking about people like the heroine of this remarkable documentary that I saw the other night. I don't know if you saw it, called From Paycheck to Paycheck. That thing should be required viewing for not only for all of us, but I'm thinking for my students. One of the reasons it's such an important documentary is that it's not about the poorest of the poor, and it's not about somebody who doesn't look like you or talk like you. It's about the working poor. It's about a woman who makes $9.20 an hour being a nurse's assistant in an old person's home. And she's trying to raise 3 children on an income that's slightly below the poverty line. For a family of 3, she makes about $20,000. Maybe she can't do it. She can't do it. But for every, and it's a remarkable, a wonderful documentary, simply because it overcomes the us-them difference. That absolutely poisons this debate politically and makes it so difficult for us to get our fellow Americans and fellow Virginians interested in this subject without us sounding holier than thou or them sounding defensive or starting to say things like, well, those people deserve what they get. So in addition to the statistical measures of destruction of a community that we could talk about in terms of crime and addiction and suicides, and the possibility of more violence, the possibility, which I take very seriously because this is my field, a study of political violence, that when problems fester long enough, you go from relatively incoherent and self-destructive behaviors on the part of people to behaviors that are more coherent, more political, and more destructive. You can move from a situation in which poor people are basically hurting each other all the time to a situation in which the crime and the criminal activities that they're involved in are spreading. That's what the drug story teaches us. You cannot keep the drug story localized. It tends to spread, it tends to become regional, it tends to become national. We owe a great debt to the people who made Breaking Bad for showing us something about the dynamics of the drug business. When there are not jobs that are legal and normal for people to do, they're going to do something. And they're going to get involved in illegal activities. A friend of mine who lives in the south side of Chicago told me that the drug business is the only way that American society has fulfilled its promise to create jobs in the ghetto. Because if you've been around and interested in urban affairs or in poverty issues as long as I have, you know that roughly every 5 years we get another promise. Although lately the promises have been not coming too thick and fast either, to rebuild the cities, a Marshall Plan for the cities, the urban opportunity zones they used to call them, and so forth. Only urban opportunity that's been created in recent years has been created by the drug business. So it's certainly possible. We saw it happen in the 60s, and we could see it happen again, that this incoherent violence moves to the level of riots or ethnic violence, or even, God forbid, terrorism. And again, one thinks of the prophets, saying, when you don't solve these problems that are basically the products of unrighteousness, you are going to pay a price. So, let me say that, backing off a little bit from this doom and doom scenario, that there's another side to the story today, and that is, I have to say, I have never taught students who are as interested in these problems, not since the 60s, have I taught students that are as interested in these problems as my students are now. I announced a course, and this is an undergrad, I teach mainly graduate courses on Arlington campus, of George Mason, but I also teach a few undergraduate courses in Fairfax. So we announced a course on structural violence, including poverty, crime, the prison system, and so forth, where we would take a look at these things and try to talk about their causes and what possible cures. And it was standing room only. They had to turn students away and not because they like me, because they like the subject. And they have been asking me ever since, what should I do? What should I do? What can I do? And I must say, one of the things I tell them now that I know about SALT and now that I know about you folks is talk to these people. But it's still an interesting and difficult question to answer. Let me try to say why before I totally run out of time here. First of all, when we try to deal with poverty issues and PIP issues altogether, I think one of the first things we run into is a kind of a narrative problem. And people in conflict resolution have become very interested in the importance of storytelling in causing conflicts and possibly curing conflicts. The narrative problem. In America for a long time there's a tradition that says people who are poor or that sort of trouble, people who commit crimes also are doing it of their own free will and are responsible for their fate. They made wrong decisions, and this narrative of individual responsibility makes everybody responsible for exactly where they're at. And is sometimes coupled with a narrative that says society can't really do anything about that, government can't really do anything about that. It's all a matter that needs to be left up to individuals. Well, without denying the fact that people do have free will and do have to always bear a certain responsibility for their own decisions, what that narrative lacks is any sense that what's gone wrong is a system, not just something happening in individual people's heads, but something happening in the society as a whole. You don't need me to tell you that there's been no serious increase in wage levels in the United States for 40 years. You don't need me to tell you about jobs migrating offshore, or this deluge of low-wage jobs that we're now dealing with. So that even if you're working regularly, there's a good chance you're going to be poor. So I'm not going to go into those statistics either. Just want to say that the most difficult thing in the world, and not only for those folks out there, but for us, for ourselves, and even for people in public service, is to think of the ways the system is responsible for this situation. The way that the system is failing and what needs to be done to change the system. And as soon as I say let's change the system, and yeah, I'm talking about capitalism, the way it's operating now. People say, oh, well, he's some kind of communist, or he's talking about some kind of revolution. So part of our job, it seems to me now, is to overcome this false contrast, this false dichotomy between reform and revolution. We're trapped kind of now in a way of thinking in which either you do reforms that are completely safe and are guaranteed to have not much effect on the system, while they help some people who badly need help. They're safe because they don't make too many waves, on the one hand. Or on the other hand, system change, and then the nightmare stories, the narratives there are the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, other places that have made big changes in society but at a tremendously high cost, a horrible cost. So the question then becomes, can we get system change which doesn't carry with it the same kind of violence, mass violence, and the same kind of high cost as some of the nightmare scenarios suggest? And I'm sure the answer is yes. And the reason I know the answer is yes is because my first time I ever saw my mother and father cry was when Roosevelt died. Because I know something about the New Deal and some other reform, and I know something about the Civil Rights Movement, I know something about some other movements where major changes were made with a minimum of violence. It is possible to get serious change that actually transforms the system, but we're not very good at being able to say which kinds of reforms lead towards system transformation and which kinds of reforms are dead ends in a sense, or even band-aids, or make the system in effect stronger or more resistant to change. Because of that, it seems to me, we're at a point where I want to say two things. Number one, no question that there's enormous ferment in this society right now on the part of people, especially younger people and older people. People in the middle, they're okay too, but the student-age people and the seniors are especially up in arms about these issues, perhaps for obvious reasons. And if you go online and look at any one of a number of websites that I'd be happy to supply if you don't know them already, I'll give them to John and he can pass them on, you'll see tremendous ferment in communities, local communities, rural communities, urban communities, cities around the country, of people who are trying to do something to make a difference and who are wrestling with these issues of reform and system change. So I mean, this is very hopeful, a very hopeful sign. But also, I have to say, we are finally in the universities starting to pay the kind of attention to these issues that we should have been paying a long time ago. My own field paid very little attention to the issues until recently, and now we are establishing, well, we just hired 2 new faculty members to work on these issues. The students want to work on them. And so I have a couple of suggestions to make in this last gasp that I've been given. Not legislative suggestions, you know a lot more about that than I do, specific legislative suggestions. But suggestions about how to develop ideas for legislative proposals and how to develop ideas for community action programs. One, wire the universities together. Let's wire them. We are doing this, and I've now spoken to colleagues at some other area universities who are also interested, and I've talked to colleagues downstate who are interested. I'm being invited to speak in April and to meet with students and so forth at Norfolk State and at Thomas Nelson Community College and some other downstate locations, just because people are so interested in this stuff and want to talk about what they can do to make a difference. I think that this is up to us, but we need to do it to get the universities to start participating in generating ideas about what causes poverty, inequality, and precarity, what can be done about it, what in practical sense can be done about it, what kinds of changes change the system and don't just don't help people only in the short term. Second idea that's been surfacing lately is for there to come into existence a state commission on poverty or poverty and inequality, depending on how you want to define the task of the commission. A state commission that would be composed of distinguished public servants and private citizens who want to participate, who would actually hold hearings in various parts of the state on what the causes of poverty here, there, or elsewhere are, and what can be done about it. And one of the subjects you're going to be hearing about here in a moment, what works? On a community level, what works and what doesn't work? That kind of commission would, it seems to me, focus the sort of public attention on this problem that hasn't been focused enough, despite our efforts. And that's the sort of venue in which people might talk about questions of broader significance too, like whether there should be a right to a job, not just have a job be a privilege, but how our thinking can change about basic issues like that, so that we may be able to start thinking again, as was thought in the New Deal in the 1930s. People have a right to work. Not in the Virginia sense of right to work, in the human sense of right to work. People have a right to work. It's not a privilege. And they can't be held responsible for their bad situation unless that right's vindicated. So our work is only starting. You people are a great inspiration to us, and I hope we're going to be working together for a long time. Thank you very much.
Because I wanted to ask a very germane question before we